For my project, I chose identity versus role confusion, which is one of Erikson's 8 psychosocial developmental stages. A healthy developing individual passes through these stages from infancy to late adulthood, and he characterizes an individual advancing through these stages by either successfully completing or not completing the stage by solving a crisis with two conflicting forces. Now, with the stage that I am going to be focusing on is identity versus role confusion. Now, identity versus role confusion, there was conflicting age ranges, but generally it's from 13 to 18. Sometimes they're pushing it back to 21 with different societal shifts that are happening due to college and extended education, but for now we'll just say 18. Now, with identity versus role confusion, the main task or psychosocial crisis in this stage is determining who am I. Now, this is a very common thing with teenagers struggling to figure out who they are with experimenting with different friends, different behaviors, just figuring out they're forming social relationships, making new friends, changing friends, and also a biological task that's happening during this to make it even more difficult to complete the stage is puberty. Now, I won't get into the details of puberty, but puberty is a huge factor as far as people that develop late or people that don't develop at all. This does, in fact, affect their social standing, which can also affect successful completion and gaining virtue from the stage. Now, during this stage, identity versus role confusion, the basic breakdown for the developmental tasks would be the biological task being puberty. Now, most people go through puberty, but it's at different time frames. Some it'll happen during the identity versus role confusion stage. Some it'll happen in adolescence. The emotional task is the basic virtue, which is fidelity. That is the virtue that we're trying to achieve during identity versus role confusion. Now, the spiritual task is forming a self-identity, and part of forming a self-identity is gaining confidence through the physical task of forming social relationships. Now, during identity versus role confusion in this stage of Erikson, the central themes happening would be obviously transitioning from being a child into an adult. And during this time, they're trying to figure out their role, how they fit into society, basically developing a sense of direction on what they want to do with their life, like experimenting with different roles, different activities, different behaviors. This is where you'll see a lot of parents saying their child is going through a phase. This is all natural. It's a part of the central theme of trying to figure out who you are during this stage. Basic strengths or virtues from constructive resolution of this stage would be fidelity. Now, a positive outcome of this conflict resolution would be the ability to relate to others and form genuine relationships. Now, major challenges at this stage, there's a lot. The main one being teens' behaviors are very unpredictable and impulsive. They're very experimental in nature. This can lead to little insight into consequences, different actions, changing and forming different social groups, fitting in, trying to feel accepted by peers and even their family, developing a sense of independence from parents, which sometimes is more difficult for different children depending on if their parents are helicopter parents or how they're raised. They're also forming different beliefs and desires which might not align with their family's belief system, such as if a child realizes as they're sexually maturing that they're gay and their family is not okay with that, that can lead to a whole lot of not feeling accepted and creating real role confusion. During this stage, there are many environmental risks. I think the main one, even though it wasn't discussed that much in the literature, is bullying. Bullying is a big risk during the identity versus role confusion stage because teens can be mean. It really depends on a person's ability to fit in with their peers. And if they don't have that ability, that can lead to physical harm. Different social settings also, such as parties or just outings with different friends, may induce peer pressure to try alcohol and other substances, which is another environmental risk during this identity versus role confusion stage. Now, another risk is family risks at this stage, which I did mention briefly, but if the child is forming beliefs that do not align with their family, this can cause problems at home. Not even if a child is gay, they could even have different religious or moral values. Their gender, sexuality may be different from what their parents wanted for their child. There's a lot of different factors, but with resolution of this stage, fidelity and devotion, it's basically forming an identity and a sense of direction and successfully becoming an adult. Now, dystonic resolution of this stage is fanaticism, not forming a strong sense of self, denial about their life, unable to form meaningful relationships. This could lead to negative consequences when resolving future stages, such as the next stage, which would be intimacy versus isolation, which could lead to promiscuity. Different coping skills that result from actually resolving this crisis would be having a strong sense of who you are, a strong sense of your morals and your beliefs when different situations arise, sticking to your guns, sticking to what you believe. There's also a lot of connections, like I mentioned, to future stages and previous stages. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of different connections to previous stages, depending on positive resolution, which impacts the success of this stage. So if they didn't successfully complete past stages, it's more difficult to successfully complete this stage. One example would be forming an inferiority complex, which can influence someone's ability to form meaningful relationships. Now, in the previous stage, if they did develop this inferiority complex, a sense of low self-esteem, there's a less chance of forming a strong sense of identity, because without confidence, how can you be sure of who you are? Aspects of previous stages playing out would also be, if we're going to go stage by stage, trust versus mistrust, either trusting or having mistrust for people in the world in general. Anatomy versus shame, either having a sense of independence and abilities or having low self-esteem and feeling shameful. Initiative versus guilt, either developing a sense of confidence or a sense of purpose or feeling stifled and guilty. Another stage that happens before this would be industry versus inferiority, which is either feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment in life or forming an inferiority complex, which I mentioned can affect a person's ability in this stage to form social relationships, which is a huge part of forming an identity. Now, if you do not resolve certain different crises throughout these stages, or poorly resolved crises, there's different forms of therapy. One example being cognitive behavioral, which deals with childhood trauma and basically working through each stage, acknowledging where certain behaviors and defense mechanisms originate from. Strength-based recovery plans, just going one by one, figuring out where different issues originate from, like trust issues or inferiority complexes, the inability to form meaningful relationships, where did they start, and basically building on each virtue one at a time. I briefly mentioned each stage is also not only dependent on previous stages, but future stages. One specifically being intimacy versus isolation. Without a strong sense of self, we can't develop intimate relationships, which is going to lead to loneliness and emotional isolation during the next stage, intimacy versus isolation. Now, during the following stage, which would be generativity versus stagnation, if we don't find a sense of direction during identity versus role confusion, then during the stage we can't engage in meaningful work. We can't leave a mark on the world in a meaningful way if we don't have a sense of direction. Also includes integrity versus despair, because if we didn't have a sense of direction and we didn't form meaningful relationships and we didn't have accomplishments, whether it's personal relationships or accomplishments that gives us a sense of integrity, then it leaves a person feeling bitter and depressed and wishing they should have or could have. There are aspects of this stage and future stages that I think are changing since Erikson did develop this model, such as delayed adolescence and extended amounts of schooling, which impacts our society's ability to form relationships that lead to marriage and have children, because with this extended schooling, relationships get pushed back from the early 20s to even the early 30s, or even further than that, which pushes back the whole concept of marriage and children, which is the whole point of intimacy versus isolation stage, which also leads into the following stage, where you could either generate or be stagnant. Without a strong sense of identity, people may try many different career paths, and then they may feel that they're switching career paths so much that it's difficult to move up the success ladder, leading to stagnation during that stage. And even in the last stage, integrity versus despair, if a person does not figure out their role in society at their end of their life, they may feel unaccomplished and bitter. There are different expectations if a psychosocial crisis is unresolved at this stage. Without answering the question, who am I? What do I want to do with my life? They lack the ability to set goals, accomplish milestones, whether it's personal or academic. They won't have a strong sense of their own beliefs, lacking different morals, lacking character. They may even be pressured to conform to their parents' ideas for the future, leading to just an unhappy life. Now, looking at a different way to psychoanalyze somebody's life would also be a chronosystem, which includes different transitions and shifts in a person's lifespan that can change the overall outcome of how a person turns out in different stages of their life. One example being, if parents are getting divorced, it may negatively impact their confidence, but after a year or two, it may actually improve their home life by making it more stable. Now, my case study example that I chose was Tony Soprano from the show The Sopranos. I've recently gotten into that show, and I'm very into the fact that he actually is a mobster that goes to therapy to psychoanalyze why he does certain things and why he is the way he is. And central themes from life course theory based on Tony Soprano, by analyzing and looking at the structural, social, and cultural context of who he is. By looking at a person's life history, you can actually see how early events in Tony Soprano's life, like watching his father going into the butcher shop and chopping the butcher's fingers off because he didn't pay, impacted Tony to the point where later on in life, whenever he would see cold cuts, because when his father cut the fingers off of the butcher, he saw cold cuts. Whenever he would eat cold cuts, he would have panic attacks, and that's how he figured out why he was having panic attacks. Now, by using life course theory during identity versus role confusion stage, meaning from 13 to 18, and applying it to Tony Soprano's life. Now, although we do not see the previous, we don't get too much detail about his past, but in therapy, they do discuss how when Tony was doing poorly in school when he was 13, 14, 15, he saw his father, who was a mobster, making good money as his only way out of having to do school. He hated school, he hated the academics, and this was his example of how this life course theory applied to him forming his identity by looking up to his father. Another example with the life course theory would be how Tony Soprano witnessed his father dating all these girls behind his mother's back, and he thought that was the way of life for a mobster, and that's what he carried into his own marriage later on when he married Carmela, and he continued to have different affairs behind Carmela's back, and he didn't see anything wrong with it. There are a lot of different theories that would be useful to understanding Tony Soprano at this life stage. I personally chose Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory because you're looking at different systems like the microsystem, your family, your friends, your neighbors, your classmates, whoever you have direct contact with, and how you form your identity and your role in the world. And with the example of Tony Soprano, you can see how his family, he comes from a mobster family. He really didn't have any role models other than mobsters, and that's where he formed his identity to become a mobster. There are other systems involved in the biosocial ecological theory by Bronfenbrenner, but for time's sake, I'm just going to speed through them. The mesosystem, which is the relationship between the microsystems in your life. And the last one would be the exosystem, which is the link between the context where a person does not have any active role and the context where it is actively participating, which would affect identity versus role confusion. Like one example, such as going off to college, completely affects how someone can finish this stage without interference in their home microsystem. At home, they may not have the ability to express who they were or who they are, but going away to college, they are able to finally express who they are without the hindrance of their family. The reason I chose the bioecological systems theory and why it would be useful in working with Tony Soprano, well, the main reason being the systems theory looks at the environment that we operate in and how development is shaped by, interactions with specific environments versus a lifespan approach as understanding different influences between development and their surroundings and how they affect each other both ways. Successfully completing identity versus role confusion, the positive outcome would be a good sense of who you are, being strong and independent, able to form relationships, goals, accomplishing those goals, having a strong belief system, having morals, and having character. Negative outcomes if you didn't successfully complete identity versus role confusion, having no sense of who you are, who you want to be, or following a plan laid out by your parents, leading a miserable life, which I don't know which one's worse. Lacking a belief system, being more susceptible to peer pressure because you don't have a belief system, or the confidence to say no. There's also more dangerous forms of self-exploration, such as alcohol, drug experimenting, and there's also a higher risk of more high-risk behaviors, and there's no sense of future. The main intervention to help resolve the psychosocial crisis during the identity versus role confusion stage would be just supporting self-exploration to increase, self-awareness. A therapist could help facilitate ongoing self-exploration, help articulate their internal sense of who they are, forming self-determinism, which is important when resolving the conflict. Who am I and what do I want to do? Which is the whole point of the identity versus role confusion stage. Figuring out who you are so you're able to form relationships, intimate relationships later on, and able to figure out what they want to do, so later on they don't feel stagnant or bitter. But I think identity versus role confusion is a very important stage. Probably the most important, because you're figuring out who you are, which follows you the rest of your life. I thought it was the most interesting of Erikson's stages with this psychoanalytical theory, and that's why I chose it. But thank you very much for everything, Professor Levy. Right now it is 1 o'clock in the morning, and I had to wait until everybody was asleep to do this assignment, including the cat. But thank you for everything.